Hello. Thank you all for coming. This is a wonderful turnout for Lauren Rosenberg. And I have a little bio to read, but it looks like she has a lot of colleagues here. So thank you for your support and some students. Wonderful. So this is about the 5th author series that we've had. If any other professors that are in the audience have a publication that they'd like to showcase, we've got space next semester, so just let me know. Be happy to give an event for you. So most of you know Lauren, but I'm going to read a little background. Of course, she's an associate professor of English at Eastern. She regularly teaches first-year writing courses as well as courses in composition theory, literacy studies, and creative writing. Until recently, she coordinated the first-year writing program. Her writing has appeared in Community Literacy Journal Reflections, called Reflections, a journal of public rhetoric, civic writing, and service learning, and in a number of co-authored book chapters and articles on feminist rhetorical practices and writing program administration. Threaded through all of her work is a commitment to examining and advocating for equity through community engagement and public activism. Her early work in service learning and composition with newly arrived immigrant groups led to a career-long interest in the literacy practices of underrepresented populations. So today we are going to listen to Professor Rosenberg talk about her new book, The Desire for Literacy, Writing in the Lives of Adult Learners. Thank you again for coming.
Thanks, Carol. Thanks, Carol. And actually, thanks to all of the librarians who set up this event. And I was really touched that there was an opportunity to do something like this, and that Carol contacted me and said, hey, would you like to give a book talk? And I just think it's great. I think we don't have a lot of opportunities at Eastern to bring students and faculty together for something like this to really celebrate our scholarship. So it was really exciting to me to work with Carol and to set this up. And thanks everyone who's here, colleagues and students and friends. Thank you so much for coming. Here's how I'm going to split the time. I'm going to talk about, there are 2 parts to this. One is the study, which I conducted and then wrote about in the book, and the other is the making of the book. So I'm going to talk about the study a little bit and read sections of the book, and then if people want to ask about the making the book, the production of the book, I can do that sort of during the Q&A afterwards. But right now, I just want to tell you a little bit about the study and how I got involved in doing literacy research. This project started out 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago, about 12 years ago as a dissertation. I'd already had an interest in adult literacy issues before I got into that project, and that stemmed from my work teaching composition courses with a service learning component years and years ago, back when I was a part-time instructor at Sacred Heart, and I started working with my students in Bridgeport with newly arrived immigrants. And while I was doing that work, I just started noticing a lot about who had access to literacy, who didn't, and it sort of led me on this very long journey. So I think rather than describe it, I'm going to start by reading a section early in the book where I tell my own story. So this is a section of the first chapter. This is the only explicitly autobiographical part of the book, and the section's called Lauren, this literacy worker's story. At first, my students do service learning projects with newly arrived immigrants in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Sometimes I go with them into the schools and community centers where they mostly tutor or do childcare. They bring the challenges of their experiences back to class, and this becomes the center of our discussions, the complexity of writing and assimilating. Who gains literacy in a new country, and who is denied? Along with my students, I volunteer, working with a Haitian woman who is learning to read and write in English. The woman I tutor has never been to school, has never written in her native Creole. She's getting older now, and as a non-literate immigrant, the work she can get is cleaning tables and floors at Burger King. We meet at a Catholic agency that provides classes and childcare to women and their children. Later, we meet at the woman's home. Our sessions are difficult. She needs to pay bills and fill out medical forms. Both she and her husband have health problems, but gaining literacy is hard. The instructions on forms confuse her. She cannot remember how to spell Bridgeport. Even shaping letters on the page is a difficulty. We both feel frustrated when she cannot complete functional tasks. I begin to understand how it works, how non-literacy, coupled with immigrant status, complicated by age, race, and poverty, maintains her habitus. I meet another woman through a library ESL program. She is well employed as a supervisor of a university food court, and she enjoys the benefits of middle-class life. Still, as a food service employee with basic literacy, she's locked in. She cannot advance to head chef, nor can she get out of kitchen work. Even though she has lived in the United States all her adult life and is a fluent speaker of English, her experience of quitting school in Korea in 6th grade leaves her feeling unable to learn. She's developed a system for seeking opportunities to gain literacy, but then quitting as soon as she feels threatened. Our tutoring relationship goes on for 4 years. It is often turbulent because of her pattern of quitting and returning. During that time, I'm a graduate student. I do a pilot study for a seminar on Chung Suk's cycle of pursuing and rejecting literacy instruction. And I learn that she is subjected to an ideology that excludes her as a semi-literate immigrant, and also that she self-subjects, portraying herself as stupid in her own mind. She's acting out Foucault's 2 meanings of the word subject, subject to someone else by control and dependence, and tied to his own identity by a conscience or self-knowledge. This is a quote. Both meanings suggest a form of power which subjugates and makes subject to, unquote. By internalizing these contradictory definitions of discourse, Chung Suk simultaneously maintains and subjugates herself. Her quitting cycle reflects Fanon's description of how colonialism is internalized as a force that one turns upon oneself. When confronting his otherness in white culture, Fanon notices about the black man, quote, a feeling of inferiority? No, a feeling of non-existence, unquote. By the end of that project, I know that I will continue to work with adult learners, that I am compelled to understand the turbulent opposing impulses that draw people to literacy and that also repel them. I want to work with non-immigrants, though, because gaining literacy in adulthood is a different problem when it is not about second language acquisition. Then it is about the politics of an educational system that has withheld its promises from some citizens. It is almost kept a secret that many Americans are unable to read and write. Victoria Purcell Gates reflects on this when she writes about a mother and son who live in, quote, a world without print. There's a good deal of reporting and analysis in adult basic education, but the topic of adult non-literacy is rarely addressed in writing studies. In this book, I deal with that absence and its effects, literacy when it is withheld, and what it means to gain literacy under unconventional circumstances. I write now to highly literate readers, people who make their living by words, by the power they possess to use, even to play with language. I want to tell you about the lives of people who come to writing and reading an alternate way because they value literacy differently from most of us. When I talk about my project with another community literacy researcher, someone who knows my work well, he gives me this imperative. No one has heard these people's voices. If you don't get them out there, they will continue to be unheard. So, I designed this study that looked into the literacy practices, especially the writing of a group of people, and I wanted to look outside of school at what kinds of choices people were making when they came to literacy for their own purposes. Initially, my focus was on choice and motivation. So I wanted to understand why do people want it if they're not going to get a better job or a degree or a credential? And what makes people seek out literacy when they're already adults in the middle of their lives and they've had jobs, they've had families, they've done all kinds of things? I looked at a lot of different sites and talked with lots of different program directors, and I finally settled on a program at a library called Read Right Now that really matched with my goals. The two main reasons that it really worked for me was that this center had been founded on Freirean principles, so they'd had a liberatory program ever since they started in 1987, and because of that, their goal had always been to make learners' sort of desires the center of the curriculum, so that the learners who came there got to really work with their teachers on choosing curriculum and deciding what they wanted to learn about. It wasn't like a GED prep program or a workplace prep program. The other reason that Read Right Now was a great site for me was because people were writing all the time, and writing was really a daily part of their program. So what I did was I worked with 4 people, and I worked with the whole community really for a while, just listening in on their classes and talking with them about their literacy experiences. And then I settled on the 4 people who became the 4 participant writers who are in this book. So I'm going to read some passages from the book where they talk about their writing and read from their writing. And I'm going to start with George, and this is the very opening of the book. George, a 60-year-old African-American man who has been learning to read and write during the last few years, recalls an interaction he had with a non-literate woman while waiting in the cashier's line at the supermarket. This is George speaking. I think it was the store somewhere, and this person was ahead of me. She didn't know what she was doing because, see this big sign right there? But it's just like I say, you don't know how to read and write, you don't know what that sign up there's saying. And I was able to assist, to show her. I didn't do it in a way to make myself look big, doing the way to try to embarrass her because of other people's behind me. I put it in a way like, well, you just didn't see that word. But I know she saw that word. She didn't know what it is. You don't do it to try to harm someone else, to make yourself look big. You do something to try to help somebody in a way that you won't embarrass the person. You know what I mean? Because you got to look at the time when you couldn't read and write. I look at it myself. Somebody had embarrassed me too. Oh yeah, I've been embarrassed. It got to the point, well, can't you read? And do you know? I can't. You can't read. This is George now, proud that he is literate and able to help someone else in the way that he would like to have been helped himself, telling yet another story about a time he spent at the store and what goes on there. He loves going to the supermarket and walking the aisles, and he loves reading the labels on things. George's memory of intervening in a non-literate woman's shopping experience to prevent a painful encounter exemplifies the kind of restorying that the 4 adults in this book engage in as they become more literate. Here he expresses his awareness of how non-literacy operates. Now that he is able to read and write, George has the confidence to flip the incident into a narrative in which he can be compassionate and act on someone else's behalf. His display of sensitivity and action also reveals a benefit I gained from working with him. Testimonies like George's helped me, a researcher studying people's experiences of acquiring new literacies, understand why and how people claim literacy for their own purposes. I learned from George and his peers to read carefully between and underneath the layers of stories like this one, to look for multiple expressions of how people respond to the ways literacy is used to manipulate and denigrate, as well as to look for what motivates individuals to confront the subject position of quote-unquote illiterate. Over the years of my study and afterwards, when I extended my work into a longitudinal project with 2 of the original participants, I found that adult learners already possess critical awareness of how an ideology of literacy has positioned them as less than whole. I also learned through this project that their motivation to seek literacy later in life comes from a long-time desire to read and write that is not necessarily linked to material or ideological aspirations. And I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. The common presumption that a person who can't read is a person who can't know invalidates the experiences of some Americans and denies that they have critical perspective. Just because a person doesn't know how to read and write doesn't mean that person is unable to think. Mike Rose has argued that, quote, to be literate is to be honorable and intelligent. Tag some group illiterate, and you've gone beyond letters. You've judged their morals and their minds, unquote. This judgment is at the root of what George speaks of the embarrassment George speaks of, which he will go out of his way to help another person avoid. In his account of how the woman in the supermarket was treated, he acts to maintain her dignity. Yet, while he may be motivated primarily by an impulse to protect her from being insulted by the condescending behaviors of more literate cashiers and customers, George also knows from his own experience that even though some people might be unconscious in their judgment of others, at times people are deliberately demeaning and will purposely hurt others by insulting their abilities. So that's George. My little Post-its are falling out because I've moved them around so many times. I got one more George. Just kidding. So I'm going to read another section about George. This is from a later chapter. And in this part, George and I are talking in an interview about work. And George really identifies himself as a worker. And whenever I'd ask him any questions, he would answer them in terms of work, even if they weren't about work. So it was really hard, actually, to get him outside of talking about work. But here he's talking about work. So George and I are talking in an interview, and he's talking about the main career he had during his life. For nearly 20 years, George worked in drop forging, a hot, heavy, and precise process of shaping material. This is him. I worked at Moore Drop Forge, making different things for airplanes, and Ford Motor Company, and Sears, wrenches and one type or another. Wasn't a whole lot. They didn't know I couldn't read and write. Far as, you see, you had to set up a job. When you set up a job, you got to set up by 1,000, 10,000, 15 or 20,000, or either half inch, an inch, or whatever. You got to be exactly right. But see, I learned this from working with people, from experience. I learned, because when you couldn't read and write, you have to make sure, you see what you see, in your head. You got to know what you learn, what you see other people learn, what you see other people do. And I learned. This is me. The tough part was figuring out how to calculate measurements when he didn't know how to use classroom tools like a compass and protractor, or how to read a ruler. George had to create his own formulas that were correct and precise and that wouldn't expose a gap in his learning. He didn't want other people to think that he didn't know. George was on a team of 3, creating templates for mass production. The work was constant and it was hot. The men on the crew depended on one another. No one could slip up. Back to George. Hard work didn't bother me so, and that was a hard job. But I learned how to do that job, and it wasn't a whole lot of reading and writing in the job. At most, something like was math. That's what you had to, kind of deal with the most, the math. And I learned, I tell you, out of 300 people in my department, I was the second highest paid man. They posted on the board, that made me feel good. Because a lot of people didn't know I couldn't read and write. And being one of the second highest paid man in the shop, out of all those people, it made me feel good. And I felt to myself like I had accomplished something, and I know how to do my job. You didn't have to tell me I know how to do it. You know what to do, so it made me feel good. And then this is me talking. Writing. 300 men viewed him as an expert. They acknowledged that George had, quote, accomplished something, unquote. He knew it by his high wages. He was valued, and he valued himself. People at the drop shop didn't know that he couldn't read and write, and George was able to keep his non-literacy covered up with his outstanding workplace performance. But George's prowess didn't last. Sometime in the mid-1980s, the work was outsourced overseas, and the forge closed. The shutting down of the forge, and with it the end of long-term, steady employment, came as a shock. This is George. They closed it. Everybody around there was hurting. Some guys was too old to get another job, and some of them, a lot of guys, was lucky to get another job, you know? And me, I didn't have no education or go get a better job than I had there. And I began to worry, and I began to think. I began to think about my education then, you know, what I didn't have to deal with searching, getting another job. I knew I could get another job, but I wouldn't get a job that paying me like the job that I had. I didn't know where to go to get an education. I knew I couldn't just go to a public school. They wouldn't accept me. I was too old for that. And it took me a while before I found out. I went and got another job, you know, working. It wasn't what I wanted, but I had to live, so I had houses, one stuff or another, you know, mortgage to pay. I've had to work, but I still, in the back of my mind, I still wanted an education. Non-literacy gnawed at George in a way it hadn't in years. It was harder to push to the back of his mind. He took a job at the gun factory down the road where he could do the work he knew, but conditions weren't as good. At Smith & Wesson, they had one man doing the job of 3. And then I'm going to, that's enough of George. I'm going to skip ahead to another chapter, and now we're at the Literacy Center. So this is a little bit about the environment at Read Right Now. Everybody at Read Right Now has a story. There's Calvin, who's been in and out of the center since it opened. He still sounds out every word when he reads, tracing a line under the text with his leathery brown fingertip and attempting to make meaning. And Terrence, who seeks advice from the teachers about how to handle his divorce. Sometimes he tears up when he talks about how his wife abused him, but then his tears reveal another level of frustration and anger as he describes his meetings with the lawyer who demands that he sign here and here. The lawyer won't explain what the documents mean. He won't read them aloud to Terrence. He talks to him like Terrence doesn't understand. Just because you can't read doesn't mean that you don't know. Terrence trembles when he says this. It's unjust. I'm like a blind man. He explains that people manipulate you when you don't know how to read and write, and their actions can be very hurtful. There are women who had babies when they were girls, or who had to raise their mother's babies. Women who've endured jail sentences, abuse, depression, diabetes. There's always poverty. This book is about the literacy experiences of 4 people who studied at Read Right Now, but it could have been about many other learners who went there because despite the challenges of their lives, they had always wanted to read and write. And I'm going to read a little bit about one of the other participants in the book. This is one of the women, Violetta, and this is at this center. On my first day in her classroom, I noticed Violetta looking at me every time I glance in her direction. I cannot tell whether I'm making her uncomfortable with my presence or whether she's interested in the stranger in the room. She says she wants to show me the portfolio of her work. Everyone at Read Right Now has a binder on the shelf that contains completed writing, but not everyone references the portfolio as Violetta does when she pulls it down that day. She says, "This is my life book." Her nod instructs me to start reading. She watches me thumb through the pages of the binder. When I linger on the confessional piece titled My Mask, she says, "That one I put in the publication anonymously." I wonder, if she's published the narrative anonymously, then why is she willing to share it with a stranger? Why is she so trusting? Her dark, concerned eyes tell a different story from her open face and smile. Perhaps she believes her writing needs to be made more public. Is the writing in this portfolio her form of social action? Months later, I asked Violetta about her decision to share her personal writing with me so soon after we met. She is unruffled. This is her speaking. And when I share you with this, I can feel it in my heart. You a nice person. I know you not do with that. I can feel in my heart. Although her life is difficult and complicated, Violetta is not cynical. She wants to be open to people, to learning, to all of life's experiences. Occasionally, she brings her portfolio home to share with her children. Here's what Mommy is learning in school. Each piece of her finished work is neatly presented with a plastic cover, and each piece is accompanied by a written explanation of why she included it in the portfolio. Although this is the procedure that all learners are asked to use, only Violetta composes her book with such dedication. Only Violetta connects the portfolio to her life outside the program. Every narrative represents an aspect of Violetta's life and an opportunity for her to reflect on where she is in terms of the progress, and that's her word, I don't talk about progress, in terms of the progress of her literacy education. What's inside her life book? Poems, stories, essays, and the periodic goal statements that everyone at Read Right Now is asked to write. This is where learners articulate their learning and life ambitions. For example, George wants to build a shed. Violetta wants to write a letter. She writes a letter to her son in prison. Then she writes a letter to her social worker. Violetta explains why in her monthly written goal statement. My most important goal is to learn how to write a letter. I'm going to start by learning how to make the letter. I will learn how to do the punctuation. When I do the letter, I'm going to use the words correctly in the present or past tense. I'm going to write a letter to my son and my mother. When I'm done with my letter, I'm going to have my teacher check them. Writing a letter is important to me because I want to write a letter. I never wrote a letter by myself. I would like to do a letter by myself. When some people write a letter to me, I want to write back, but I don't know how to write a letter. This is important for my life. While Violetta's classmates edit and type their goal statements, she moves ahead and composes her first letter. Violetta says that she spoke with her son on the phone the night before. Then why write a letter? Why not just talk? She explains carefully, shaking her head so I will get it. The phone conversations are in Spanish, but the letter is going to be in English. She wants to write the letter to justify why she reported her son to the police when she discovered that he was using and selling drugs. She did this to get him off the streets so he would not get killed. And here's the letter. Dear Miguel, the reason I am writing this letter is because I love you very much. Please don't get in trouble anymore. Remember, God is all the time with you. I know you are now in the wrong place. You didn't do the right thing. My dear son, I think about you all the time. I hope you have learned the right way now. I'm going to PR this summer. I would like to see you doing excellent in your life. Remember, you have children. When your children ask about your life, what answer are you going to have for your children? I will feel better if you try to do something nice in your life. When you do the right thing, you will feel proud. This is my little letter for you. I hope when you get this letter, you feel good. God bless you. Love, Mom. Violetta says there's something about writing a letter that she cannot achieve by talking on the phone. In the letter, she gets to have her say. She gets to make her words permanent, and maybe her son will want to reflect on what she says. Maybe she can defend her position, and he will not be angry with her for turning him in. Her comments suggest that she contemplates how writing can offer her something different from speech. She has control over her language, and her son will not talk back. Violetta can express herself more effectively in English than in Spanish. I noticed the difference between her comments in English and the voice in her writing as we discuss her literacy. In speech, Violetta's English falters. She uses Spanglish, but in writing, she is able to craft the words. Her remarks about her life book help me to understand why Violetta values herself as a writer and why she prefers to write a letter to her son rather than call him. So I'm going to stop reading now, and I'm going to stop talking for a second. I'm going to stop here so that people can ask questions. We've got plenty of time, and I'd be happy to talk about the book and producing the book, which I haven't touched on at all, and also to answer any questions that you have about the other people, the study, or whatever. So talk to me.
Did you choose these 4 people based on how you felt about them, or just how they were performing, or just at random?
It definitely wasn't random. So I observed at the Literacy Center for a long time before I chose anybody, like at least 6 months. And I would go a few times a week and sit in on the classes and talk with people and help out a little, but I was really clear about not wanting to be their teacher. I didn't want to be in any kind of position of authority with them. I just wanted them to know me as a researcher. And as that time went on, I started to get to know some more than others, and some I really clicked with. And I got to be really close with 2 of the teachers as well, and the director of the center. And they were really helpful also. So they recommended certain people. And actually what ended up really emerging, I wasn't planning to work with older people, but they had the best attendance. And I think one of the issues for some people here have done qualitative research, and particularly studies that go on for a long time, you need people who are going to show up and who are going to keep coming back. And especially, there's a section about this in the book, for adult learners, they have so many demands in their lives. They come and go. There's a phrase in adult basic ed called stopping out and stopping back in, as opposed to dropping out and dropping back in, and people kind of come and go. So I needed a really stable population. And the teachers really recommended the 4 people. And by the time they recommended it, they'd kind of emerged as the people who were most interested and would be the best participants. So the other thing is that I wanted to represent the demographics of the center. So there were a lot, I think this is kind of unusual, there were a lot of black men. Some African American, some Caribbean, some African. And so I have the 2 men in the study are both African American men. And then the 2 women, one is a white woman from Springfield, and the 4th was Violetta. So I really wanted to sort of represent the populations who were there, kind of similar to how they were represented at the center. So yeah, thanks. Pat?
Lauren, were there any common background in why they had not learned up to this point in terms of what their experience was? Did they have, learning disabilities like dyslexia, or was it circumstantial things in their lives? Or?
Well, everybody was poor. I mean, that was the thing they had in common. A lot of people say they think they had a learning disability. Nobody was ever diagnosed for a learning disability. And I think some of that's, it's a little piece of that is about their age, actually Violetta's was 40 at the time of the study, now she's 50. But so part of it was their age, but mostly I think the people who show up at Read Right Now haven't been diagnosed for things. So, and sometimes you just can't know, how can you know, that's, like Leanne, who I haven't read about, Leanne said a lot that she was sure she had a learning disability, that she couldn't learn. She tells a story about having trouble in school because she couldn't tell time. But complicating that was, the fact that her family was really poor, she had an alcoholic stepfather, and they were always moving. So, she was moving every 3 months, so she was never really able to have relationships with teachers or anybody who would say, hey, that kid needs some testing. So there was just a lot of instability. It's really, I think my short answer is that it's really hard to separate out, what's poverty, what's a learning disability, what's an emotional issue. It's just really hard to know. Yeah, Jordan.
Yeah, so I was curious too, in terms of, I'm thinking so much of the way that oftentimes sort of literacy now has to also come packaged almost with digital literacy. That's sort of, there's an awareness of having to, navigate sort of word processing, sort of having to, that you're learning not only the language, but also how to input it, how to process it, how to get through. Did you find that with your adult learners, there was both the sort of the difficulty of learning the interface as well as the language itself, or was it sort of a step-through process? Was it predominantly pen and paper? Was it in part on machine? How did that fit into it at all?
Well, yeah, I mean, most of them had never used a computer.
Yeah.
So, and I think that's a little hard for some of us to even imagine, especially I think people who have children, because, you see like kids are using, they're computer literate. They become computer literate at the same time that they become literate alphabetically. It's simultaneous now, and which it wasn't for my generation, but people at Read Write Now had not used computers by and large. They had computers in the center, and when I was going there a lot, so that was about 10 years ago, they were, they would have time, they would write up things they'd written by hand on the computer, but they were learning to keyboard. I mean, it was very basic stuff. Now the center just got completely renovated, and now they have this large computer room, and I would imagine that for people coming in now, there's sort of more back and forth between sort of using computers and probably using websites, and there's more, they have more digital life just because it's 10 years later, but it's still, I mean, we're still talking about more learning alphabetic literacy because they don't really have it. But actually when I met, and this is another thing, is since the book's come out, I've met with all 4 of the people, which has just been extraordinary. And when I saw Chief, the other man I didn't read about, he talked about his different email addresses and how he's in touch with people by email, and he'd been in touch with George, and so I think, and he's quite literate now, and so George and the 2 men are quite literate now, and so they use the internet. And yeah, thanks, Steve.
You sort of prefaced this question with commenting on how you've gone back and you've talked to them, and I assume you've shown them the book too, or will. Is there a place in this study where you have them reflecting on being part of the study and what they think about the work that you're doing? Or have you had conversations with them about that? It's just interesting to know their perception of the work that you're doing and how they see them fitting in that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I love that question. There's 2 parts, like the then and the now.
Yeah.
As I was working with the 4 of them, I was showing them the work all the time. So like for the main study, I did a series of interviews, and so I did a first interview that was about people's literacy history, and then a second interview where we met and talked about their writing. And at the second interview, I gave them the transcript of the first interview, and we went over the transcript, and a lot of the questions for the second interview came out of the first interview, so we would sit together and I'd say, look at this here. And most of them were just like, yeah, thanks, and put it away. But actually George was really into his transcript. And when we sat together, and this was years ago, we sat with the things, and he was like, what page are we on? Like, we're on page 5. Okay, let me find that passage. And he wanted to like really be part of the process. Like, this is my document, which is what I wanted. So it was different for all of them, but we were always talking about, this is the process. I'm going to ask you this question about this piece of writing. We'll look at the writing together. What do you think of the results? And I was, during the time of the study, going over things with them. I did longitudinal studies of George and Violetta pretty much the whole time I was at Eastern until I started really working on the book as a book. So that was another 3-4 years. And then we would go over, stuff they'd written about, or they would suggest other topics they wanted to talk about in an interview. And then there's the now part, which is that I've met this fall, the book came out in the end of August. I've met with all of them, and it's kind of crazy when somebody calls you out of the blue and says like, hey, remember me, I wrote a book about you. So, and I mean, they've been really extraordinary meetings. I'm actually hoping to write a piece about this, about going back and giving each one of them the book and marked their sections and read them their sections, and I write in the front like what their pseudonym is, like you are Leanne or whatever, and I'll say like here's all the parts that are Leanne, and if you want to read this with somebody else, these are because they don't want to read about Fanon and they don't want to read about all the theory stuff. It's really about Spivak, the whole book, but so that's been really fantastic, and just seeing where people are at now and how they've used their literacy and what they're doing now. I mean, it just really varies for each of them. Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
This is probably a very basic literacy question, but I'm thinking about I was listening to the differences between your transcriptions of people's conversation and then the things they had written, and of course, we write differently than we speak usually, but I was thinking that, in this sense, literacy isn't just a technology for transcribing what's in your head. It also brings along this sort of shaping force. You think in certain ways, perhaps, because you're writing. And I was wondering, could you talk some about the perhaps the changes you saw in people over time? Were they thinking things differently, perhaps, than they might have when you began working with them, or when they began their work?
I feel like I can answer that question in so many different ways for the different people.
That was the point.
Okay.
Give you a nice big
just really broadly, there's one passage in the book. All right, I happen to have it now. No, there's actually not that one, but this other one. There's no, I don't have that one marked, but there's I have something about it marked. There's one place where George talks about literacy and how it changes you, and what he says is that, I wish I had this prepared for you because it's really fantastic. He says, when you start reading and writing, you start thinking about things in a different way, and his example is, he says, it's like China and Russia. He's like, I can read about China and Russia, and I can know things about China and Russia as if I've been to China and Russia. He's like, and even though I probably will never go to China or Russia, I can know China or Russia. So that's kind of a broad thing. But in terms of their writing, I think each of them changed as writers in different ways. Two of them more than others. Violetta and Chief were really the writers. And you can hear it in Violetta's, I think you could hear that in the sections of Violetta. She speaks really differently from how she writes. When I went to meet with her a couple months ago, I went to her house, and I came in and she had her notebook out on her kitchen table like we were going to write, which I thought was really sweet. And we didn't, but let's just talk. But she had her composition book and her pencils all lined up. But I think that for the two of them, I have a whole chapter that's just about what they do with their writing. They really latched on to writing as something that they could use to make changes, and not just personal changes, but social changes. So, Violetta, well, I'll tell you about Chief first because you don't know anything about him. Chief really saw himself as a leader in his communities, and he was really involved with his church. He was and still is a leader of his men's gospel choir. He was at the time a trustee of the church. I don't know if he is now. He's been writing music and performing his whole life. So he has this really fascinating relationship to what he calls writing a song, which has always been an oral process. But he really needed writing in his mind because he had things he needed to do with it. And so he started writing these newsletters and circulating them at his church and his sister's church, and they were all about why people should study. So writing was super important to him, and it really changed him because he could do something he wanted to do. For Violetta, she had lots of purposes for writing, really personal ones, like the letter to her son, but then also really introspective ones, like she wrote this series of pieces about being a single mother that she initially wrote to kind of work things out for herself, because her life is really hard. She had a lot of kids, grandchildren, the son in jail who's in Puerto Rico, family here, family there, and it was just really, really hard. So she did stuff to kind of restore, this is one of my big terms, she's restoring her experience, but then she also started giving first imagining that other women were reading these pieces, and then she kind of became an advocate for single mothers, for Latina single mothers. She went to a conference in Boston and gave a talk, and she was involved in this community. This was outside of Read Right Now. After she left there, she was involved in a community activism project about Latinos with HIV in the north end of Springfield, and she helped make this video, and then she spoke about the video, and she's really actually done activist things with her writing, and she sees herself as a spokesperson especially for, she says, the woman Latina. So when I gave her the book, she kept patting it, and she was like, this is for the woman. Anyone else? Yes, Sam?
I guess everyone writes differently and has their own style and I guess their own voice. And I always imagined that people develop that very young, and as they grow up have their own style. Was that something that you think impacted them or lack thereof? Do you think, were you able to still see them each have their own voice in their writing?
Oh, that's such a great question. Yeah, definitely. It's so interesting that you attach it to, something that's with you your whole life. I think that, as people, they had voice and style their whole life. And then, that's such a great question. And then when they acquire writing, it just kind of happens. I don't think, I think for some, university students in creative writing classes, you might worry about having a voice or having a style. I don't think any of these people is going to worry about having a voice or having a style. They're just going to do what they need to do. But, there's a lot of voice and style in it. Like I could pick out a piece of Chief's writing where he's writing it. Let's say he wrote this essay about violence of women against men, and it's he'll put on different voices. He writes like a journalist addressing the public because he thinks that's the best way for people to hear what I have to say. And you hear something that's part journalist and part Chief kind of coming through in that. So I think that people do, have the voices in writing that they want to have for different situations. It's a great question. Thanks. Yeah.
Do you think that mental health, does that bring out creativity, with your student? Have you ever come across that with someone who has mental health? It just brings out the beauty. Have you come across that?
I'm not exactly sure what you're asking about mental health.
Well, say someone is bipolar or depressed or something, really beautiful stuff comes out of that. Mm-hmm. So have you come across that at all? One of your students?
I think there's a lot of experiences shape how we write and who we are as writers, and I feel like there's so many people in this room who could speak to this probably better than as well or as better than I can.
I just wanted to put it out there.
Yeah, no, it's great. I feel like all of people's experiences shape how they write and who they are as writers, and for the people I worked with, there was nothing explicitly, like I said earlier, there was nothing explicitly linked to one particular experience or another, but I think they all kind of contribute to the writer. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, Phil. How's maybe something a little bit about what you took from the study? How is it? How did the study inform maybe your teaching or your own thoughts about writing and literacy?
Oh gosh, this has been like my life for so long. I feel like it's on my mind all the time. It's like what I think about all the time. And now I'm working on a new study, and that's about veterans, but it's also about people's literacy practice. I think about people's literacy practices and their relationships to their literate lives. I think about it all the time. It's definitely impacted my teaching. I think, when people say stuff like, my students, they can't write, it just makes me so mad. I just can't stand it. Usually they're talking about university students who are actually quite capable of writing very articulately, and I think my standards are really low for what it, for what it means to write and be literate, and I define literacy really, really broadly, but I also think that's really important. So I'm answering this so broadly, but I just feel like, this is what I think about all the time, and in terms of writing, it's made me. I just feel like I have like a real commitment to these issues, but also I don't think this is what you meant in this question, but it was really important to me when I was writing the book not to appropriate people's experiences and to figure out a way that I could write this book so that they could tell their own stories without me like mediating it too much. And that was really challenging, when I was working with different editors, and especially when I was in production, like talking about how the book was going to look. And I was like insistent, if this looks like a traditional academic book with my voice here and their voices here, that's another kind of subordination. And so I just feel like, literacy issues are around us all the time, and I'm just thinking about them all the time. So, but we can talk more.
One more question?
From Pat.
So anybody else want? I already asked one. I wanted you to just elaborate a little bit about when you said you don't like to talk about progress. And I inferred from that you were looking at this more as a continuum of engagement as opposed to starting linearly and ending up somewhere else. But I wanted you to say a little more about that.
Okay, I'm glad you asked that. So I have a real problem with this kind of progress model of you'll become more literate, and then you'll get, become better, and then you can get your GED, and then you can get a better job, and it's this sort of kind of upward mobility progress thing. And I think, well, first of all, it's just not true especially for a lot of the people I was working with. They're not on that trajectory. And I just think in terms of education in general, we're, don't get me started. We're this kind of progress model that everybody's getting better and moving up all the time. It's just really false in a lot of ways. And what was so wonderful about working with the 4 people is your literacy isn't about some kind of improvement. It's about, what are your goals? What do you want? What do you want to use writing for? It's Ben's question about what are people doing, changing, how are they changing as writers? And it's not like they're getting better all the time, or, we talk about it with our students all the time, he became really improved as a writer, but what is that, what does that mean in terms of your goals for that writing, or your, a lot of people said they wanted to read the paper, and that's just, for some people, reading the paper is, that's it. That's what they want. And so it wouldn't be useful to say, well, after you read the paper, then what are you going to do? Does that explain? Yeah. So I guess we're done. We have to go to our department meeting. Thanks, everyone. Go to the meeting. Thanks so much. Thanks for coming and listening.